We are starting a new series on this work of Ramana Maharshi called Ulladu Narpadu. It is also rendered in Sanskrit as Saddarshanam, and it composes of 40 verses along with two invocation verses. This work is considered to be the most important of all the various works of Ramana Maharshi because it condenses the entire teaching of self inquiry and surrender, just like the Upanishads do. So it can be considered just like any other Upanishad that we are fortunate to have rendered in the modern day, accessible to all of us. One note on listening to this before we go into the work: instead of trying to understand it by the intellect, if we listen to it from our heart, we perhaps can get the essence of it in a more natural way, because our tendency is normally to acquire knowledge. And since this is a revelation about our own being, which is the source of all knowledge, it is important to realize that this cannot be known by the intellect, but realized in one's heart. So if we listen to it in silence from our heart, then perhaps we can get maximum benefit out of this whole endeavor. With that, we'll start with the first two verses today. They are called the invocation verses, or known as Mangalam. Normally, any work starts with such an invocation, and normally this invocation is addressed to Ganesha, being the remover of obstacles. But because this work is unique in nature, it is like an Upanishad. It is written in such a way that the very invocation itself is a revelation of the truth. So the essential truth of the entire work is actually condensed in the first two verses so beautifully, and that in and of itself is the invocation for the entire work. So we'll start with the first verse, which is which we I will just chant in Tamil. It goes as follows: உள்ளதலதுள்ள உணர் உள்ளதோ உள்ள பொருள் உள்ளலர உள்ளத்தே உள்ளதால் உள்ளமெனும் உள்ள பொருள் உள்ளலெவன் உள்ளத்தே உள்ளபடி உள்ளதே உள்ளல் உணர்வாயே உள்ளே. This verse is a bit of a tongue twister, but it also, in simply 4 lines, condenses the entire teaching, the entire exposition of what is truth and how to realize truth. So the first question Ramana Maharshi asks is, can there be a feeling of existence without a substratum? That's what the first question is in this work. Ulladalad ulla porul, ulladalad ulla unar ullado. Can there be a feeling, unarvu, of existence without a substratum of that which is? In a simple way, we can ask the same question for anything. Can there be a painting without a canvas? Can there be a movie without a screen? So similarly, there has to be some kind of a substratum upon which anything exists. This is fairly obvious, and yet somehow we have many who are, either because of a voidist view or a very materialist view, somehow imagine that things came out of nothing. And then there is the other aspect of this, which is that the same question, if read differently, also asks, can that which is exist apart from truth? Which is also a very interesting question, because if we look at many um, products of creation, for example, art or technology, we can see that the creation can exist separate from the creator. We can see a painting without seeing the artist. We can see a movie without seeing the director, and so on. But here the question being asked is, can you see that which is separate from the truth that is the substratum? So if we take these two questions together, then it reveals about both the efficient and the material cause of what we call as existence. Now, when we say efficient and material cause, what we mean by that is, for anything, there are two causes. The material cause is the material with which something is brought into existence. So, for example, a painting requires the paints, the canvas, the colors, and all the rest. Those are the materials. And the efficient cause is the painter, the one who has the intelligence to render the painting. Same is true with many other arts. Now, we can see in these kinds of arts that the material cause, which is the substratum of the canvas, is always present when we see the painting, for instance, but we can see the painting without seeing the painter. Whereas here the question being asked is, can we actually see the creation without seeing the creator? So there are two questions here, and both point to a very fundamental truth, which is that neither is void source of what is, nor is the source of what is separate from what is. Because these are the two confusions which we see very prevalent. One is the voidism, and the other is dualism. Dualism is when we imagine the creation to be separate from the creator. There is the simile of dance, where we actually see the truth that the material and the efficient cause are together in the dance, because the dance cannot be seen without the dancer, and the body of the dancer is the material with which the dance is presented, and the very intelligence of the dancer is the efficient cause with which the dance is presented. And this is why the cosmic dance of Shiva is considered the symbolism of the entire creation. So these are the two questions that are being asked as part of the first verse. Because one thing we see is, we see many objects in this universe, and we also are aware of the seer. That is the senses that are perceiving objects by eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and touch. And so therefore there is the perception and there is the perceiver. But what we also see is that the perception and the perceiver come and go. They don't have any abiding truth to them. They are impermanent. So can that come and go without something that is a substratum which is always true? This is the fundamental question that Ramana Maharshi is asking. Because one thing we can see for certain is that anything that is true cannot be of the nature of being impermanent. There is a verse in the Gita which exactly mentions this very beautifully. Krishna says, Na sato vidyate bhava, na bhavo vidyate satah. So what he says is that which is unreal cannot come into existence, and that which exists always is never unreal. So anything that comes and goes is only an apparent reality, and what is there as the substratum is the ever present truth which we call consciousness. So this source, as we see, is non-different from the creation itself, because if it were different from creation, then creation, if it exists independent of the creator, which is a very dualistic viewpoint which many religions ascribe to or subscribe to, then this brings into question whether the creator, if we call creator as God, is almighty. Because if there is creation that's independent of creator, then there is might in the creation that is independent of the creator, which means creator or God cannot be almighty. So this is why both the questions point to something very important. One is, can creation come out of nothing? And the second is, can creation remains separate or independent of the creator? One simile that is often used is the rope and the snake, where in a dark night, when we see a rope, we mistake it to be a snake. This is a very good example because the snake is simply a projection upon the rope, and the rope is the very substratum of truth. The snake is an appearance that comes and goes, but the snake is never separate from the rope as well, because you cannot see the snake without the rope, and yet your seeing of the snake is itself an illusion. This example is used a lot. Of course, any example is imperfect, and why this example is imperfect is because the rope is not sentient, it is not conscious, whereas what we perceive is conscious existence. And this conscious existence has to have as its substratum consciousness, because conscious existence cannot come about from that which is unconscious. This is essentially the problem with a very materialistic view, where many imagine that matter comes together and somehow consciousness magically comes about. That defies any kind of logic, and it also has no explanation for all the various processes that are happening both at the subatomic level and at the galactic level, the micro and the macro. There is so much intelligence seen in the universe across the spectrum, and one cannot simply say that it's all just matter. So that's why this question is very important. It's fundamental to ask whether consciousness can come out of insentient matter, and second, whether conscious existence can remain separate from its source, which is consciousness. The other thing that the rope and snake metaphor reveals to us is that while they are together, the snake being a projection on the rope, seeing the snake hides the rope, as it were. Because if we see and we are afraid of the snake, we don't even see the rope, we think there is a snake. The same is true with a screen and a movie. When we see a movie, we somehow don't realize that there is a screen which is untouched by the movie. So this is the other important point to remember, is that our very seeing of the impermanent appearance and disappearance of both the seen and the seer is preventing us from a direct perception of that which is ever present as pure consciousness. So if we see this, then the next question that the same verse asks is, how does one realize it? When this pure consciousness abides without any modification, how does one realize it? First of all, why does it abide without any modification? Because that which is going through modification, as we saw, is only an appearance. Because anything that comes and goes does not in actuality exist in truth. So the consciousness that is at the substratum of all existence is not of the nature of coming and going, and therefore anything that comes and goes, whether it's our body or our thoughts or the ego, while they are all appearances in consciousness, they are not consciousness itself. They are hiding pure consciousness, just as the snake hides the rope. So the question is, how can I realize the substratum of pure consciousness, which is without any modification? Now, an auxiliary question can be asked as to why do I need to even realize the substratum? And this is simply because this is our nature. And if we are not realizing our nature, and we take ourselves to be something that comes and goes, then we see that the natural consequence is suffering. Anything that's impermanent also causes suffering. So if we attach ourselves with the body or with thoughts, mind, or with the ego, then we realize that it causes suffering either through bodily diseases or through thoughts, which is psychological suffering, or the ego, which causes hurt and many other manifestations. It even leads to wars and so many other things. So, this is not an abstract question, but this is our very heart. And this is why listening to it from our heart is very essential, to have this deep love for this question and to go to the depth of it, not through the intellect. Because if we understand something, that understanding is also of the nature of coming and going. So the question is the substratum of our existence of the nature of coming and going? It cannot be, because as we already saw, that which comes and goes has to have something that is ever present as its substratum. And because we are conscious, that which is the substratum is conscious. And because we cannot have any might independent of that energy, we are never separate from it. If we see all of this clearly, then it's very clear that our very nature, our very source is pure consciousness. It is never separate from us. It abides within us. And if we don't identify with the modifications of body and mind, then we can see that this is our real nature. So this is the question that is asked, is how do we realize it when this truth is within us without any modification? So then the last part of this verse, Ramana Maharshi gives the answer by saying, Ullatte ullabadi ullade ullal unar. That means to simply abide as being is to know, is to realize. Because as we saw already, any knowledge is of the nature of coming and going. So if I understand something today, and if my memory fades away, it's going to go away. And that cannot be the very nature of my existence. The very substratum upon which this knowledge or this understanding happens cannot be understood by that mechanism. It's something like a wave cannot understand the ocean, because a wave is part of the ocean, and understanding is a part of the wave. It comes and goes. So how do I know? How do I realize? This is the question asked, and here the answer given is, to know is to be. Because if I realize that my very nature, free of thoughts, free of modifications, that which simply abides as my very being is pure consciousness, then I cannot make it an object of knowledge. I cannot make it an object of understanding, but I can only simply abide as the subject. And that is what Sri Ramana Maharshi implies by saying to know is to be. This can also be seen in a different way by realizing that the infinite nature of existence can never be known in the sense of how we know things. So, the very attempt to know, the very attempt to acquire knowledge comes out of an ignorance within us, which thinks that what we are trying to perceive is somehow finite in nature. When we actually realize the infinite nature of pure consciousness, it is eternal, it has no beginning and no end, and it is got it, there is no time and space in it, which means it's infinite by nature. And a finite being, which is what the body is, which is what the mind is, which is what thoughts are, can never grasp the infinite. And therefore, to realize the infinite is to simply abide in the infinite, not be a finite being and try to grasp the infinite through the intellect or through thought or through knowledge, but simply abide, which is a very nice segue into what is called surrender. Because this inquiry, which is what the first verse points to, it's inquiring into the nature of truth, making it very clear what the nature of truth is, and then points out what is the way to realize the truth by concluding that to realize the truth is to be the truth. Now, in this context, I came across a beautiful quote by Sri Ramakrishna, who talks about it in a very simple way, which brings us to surrender, which is the topic of the next verse we are going to look at. He says, "Who can ever know God? I don't even try. I only call on Him as Mother. Let Mother do whatever she likes. I shall know her if it is her will, but I shall be happy to remain ignorant if she wills otherwise. My nature is that of a kitten. It only cries mew. The rest it leaves to its mother. The mother can put the kitten sometimes in the kitchen and sometimes on the master's bed. The young child wants only his mother. He doesn't know what the mother is capable of, and he doesn't even want to know. He only knows, I have a mother, why should I worry?" It is so beautifully putting in a very devotional language the very same truth that's expressed by Ramana Maharshi implicitly in this last segment of this verse by saying, to can you know this truth? You cannot know this truth, but you can simply surrender and abide in the being which is infinite in nature and which is beyond the scope of knowledge. And that takes us to the second verse as part of the invocation, where Ramana Maharshi explicitly makes it a case of surrender, where he says, Marana Bhayam Mikkulavam Makkalaranaga Marana Bhavam Illa Maheshan Sharaname Sarvartam Sarvududan Savutrar Savennam Sarvaro Savadavarnittam. What he asks here is Marana Bhayam, those who are afraid of death, when they approach the one without death and birth, the Supreme Lord, and they surrender to the Supreme Lord, then they die to their individual self, and therefore they are free of the free of the fear of death. This is exactly what we saw Sri Ramakrishna point to by saying, I only know that God, which he calls mother, takes care of everything, and she has no beginning, no end. So if you realize this, in technical terms, we can even call this as um, there is a word called Saguna Brahman. What is without attributes as pure consciousness also can be seen as with attributes, which is the personal God. And the personal God is non different from pure consciousness. And by seeing this personal God and having this relationship with the personal God and seeing him as or her, whichever form we relate to, but seeing clearly that it is not a projection of thought, it is not an imagination, but it is the source of all creation. And therefore, there is no division in this perception of God. There is no my God and your God. There is no many gods, as some people say, and all that. There is only one God, which is pure consciousness, which can take any form. And when we see this very clearly, and we approach in this devotional mood by realizing that this infinite ocean, which we call God, is so perfect and so vast that the finite mind can never understand it, which we already saw. But also now in this verse, what we say is that the finite mind, which is also of the nature of death, when it realizes that its infinite source is deathless, and that is its real nature, and that functions perfectly all the time in every atom of this universe. So, what we call God is not simply a person sitting in the sky, but the part of every single atom of the universe and responsible for all creation, all sustenance, all destruction, and all ignorance and all wisdom. This is very important to realize because otherwise, there are, as we know, um, there is a conception of Satan, for example, who is the source of ignorance and temptation and desire. This kind of a division where there is an almost equal and opposite force is, we can clearly see, not even logically consistent. Because if there is some independent might against God, then that cannot be called an almighty God. So when we see that not only wisdom but also ignorance comes from the same source, and therefore the most evil person and the most noble person are all acting according to the will of the same one God. And then we cannot understand the ways of this intelligence. So one may ask, why is there suffering, for instance, or why is there evil? One way to simply look at this question is when we even watch a movie, we see that a director creates a movie with a plot where there is suffering, there is evil, there is good, and finally there is a victory of the good over evil. And this is a play. And the same, in fact, literally the word used for creation is play. It's called Leela in Sanskrit. And therefore, this play of God is something that is beyond understanding again. So, to ask and try to understand why there is suffering, or why there is evil, or why there is ignorance, all of these questions will take us nowhere, because this is all an attempt by the finite mind to understand the infinite. If we simply realize that the infinite God is omnipotent and omnipresent, so it's present in every atom of the universe and makes all creation possible, and out of its infinite intelligence, it creates this play of duality, good and bad, happiness and suffering, light and dark. If we see this and we surrender, just as Sri Ramakrishna said, like a kitten surrenders to its mother cat, then there is no fear, because whatever happens to the body, whatever happens to thoughts, whatever happens to the ego is all part of the play, and there is no independent existence apart from that. To realize this is to know this and is to surrender to this. So these are, that's why so intricately connected these two verses, and they are so complete in the exposition of truth of God and of how to realize God. One other important point to notice here, what he says is, Maharshi says, those who through fear of death approach God. It's a very important verse, because fear of death is a very useful teacher. We notice that many great beings, in fact, including Ramana Maharshi himself, the Buddha, and many, got an intense fear of death. And that is what resulted in awakening. So, this is a very important thing for us to never forget, that this body and this mind and everything we normally associate with is dying literally every moment. This world is, that's why, called as the world of death in Sanskrit, Mrityulok, because everything here is simply in the process of dying and regenerating. It's an infinite cycle, as it were. And to get caught in this cycle in any way, either for pleasure or for some kind of accomplishment, or for some kind of even noble causes. So these map to what is typically called as the three gunas, tamas, which is dullness, where one wants to simply enjoy pleasures of the nature of what comes and goes, and only dulls the senses, or rajas, which is passion, with which one wants to accomplish things, acquire power, wealth, and so on, to only realize that all of these again come and go, or even sattva, which is called goodness, where one is attached to noble causes. But even there, the problem is that no noble cause remains forever. Everything, every good comes to an end too. And therefore, to be attached to noble causes is itself an ego, and it causes suffering, as we see in many people. So, if we realize that all activities are of the nature of death, and therefore that is the only truth in this world, and therefore I question whether that is my nature, and I realize that there is something that is eternally going on. Even our own body, what is very interesting is that the body in its own way is eternal. How? Because every cell in the body gets recycled. There is no new cell in our bodies. It was plants and animals, and they become part of nature, and then they collect together through food, and they become body, and then the body becomes again food for other bodies. coming down centuries and centuries. So things are often of the nature of eternality if we realize that manifestations are impermanent. So the particular manifestation of the body is temporary. The particular manifestation of mind or ego is temporary, and we clearly see that it comes and it goes. And if I identify with it, it is causing suffering. But if I realize that beneath this temporary manifestation is the unmanifested infinite intelligence that is ever present and eternal, then to surrender to that, as beautifully Ramakrishna pointed out, to see that the divine is infinite and the divine takes care of everything perfectly, and therefore I need not know her or know it, however we put it. I need not understand. I simply remain as I am. This is what Ramana Maharshi called as Summa Ir, be still. It doesn't mean inactive, it simply means remain fully surrendered. The one other aspect of this verse, which I also wanted to touch upon, is the importance of suffering. Because we already asked a question why there is suffering, and one answer we saw is that it is part of the play that cannot be understood. But there is also another aspect to it, because fear of death is a particular case of suffering where we see it acts as an impetus to awakening. And in general, we notice that suffering is a very helpful teacher. So instead of looking at suffering as why there is suffering, if we actually see it in the right way, we can actually welcome it. In fact, one of the most beautiful prayers in the Bhagavatam, which Kunti, the mother of Pandavas, offers to Krishna, is she says, every time there is suffering, I think of you. And when there is no suffering, I ignorantly forget. And therefore, please give me suffering so that I never forget you. It's a very beautiful prayer. And there is a very important truth there, which is that if we get attached to the pleasures of this world through any form, the three ways we said, either through simple sensory pleasures or through achievement or even through noble causes, then we seem to think we are in control, and we get attached to our doership and the results of it, only for all of it to crash one day and cause immense suffering. And again, we ignore it and move on again as if we didn't experience anything, and we again act out of the same ignorance for another temporary goal. So, to see that suffering is actually a wake up call, and to realize that suffering is the nature of this manifested universe, and therefore to not have any attachment to anything that comes and goes, but simply acting out of one's natural sense of responsibility, that will take care of itself, simply as the body functions naturally. uh, the breathing happens and the digestion happens and every function of the body happens naturally. The fact that there is no attachment doesn't mean it stops working. Simply the same way, it is not a far from being a recipe for inaction. It actually becomes a recipe for perfect action. And if we realize this, that the infinite intelligence of God takes care of everything, he who is without death and birth, marana bhavam illa maheshan, he who is without death and birth, he being eternal, infinite, takes care of every atom of this universe perfectly. If we simply realize this, that is actually the end of all sadhana. The only reason we are doing sadhana, in fact, is simply because we don't realize it at our deepest level. And that is due to all the acquired conditioning, which we call vasanas, which still takes us outward with a delusion that I am this body, I am the collection of thoughts, identifies with the thinker, with the questioner, with the knower, and then with also the idea of a seeker, and tries to understand or tries to realize. So if we see this very clearly and we abide in this seeing, which is what satsang is all about. Satsang is not to acquire anything new, to abide, but to abide in truth. Simply abide in our own being and being surrendered completely to this infinite intelligence that takes care of everything perfectly, and to not move outwardly with desire, and to associate with this revelation either through books or through meditation or through devotion or through association with others who are equally serious about realizing their nature and transcending suffering. This is the essence of sadhana. And therefore, this whole work is meant to take us deeper into this realization and simply abide in our own nature. With this, we will stop today. Now, the 40 verses which form the main crux of this work goes into various aspects of this truth, and thereby provides viveka, which is discrimination, to understand more clearly the difference between the eternal and the impermanent, and also then naturally build that clarity by which we can abide as our own nature. Thank you.